They wanted it buried. Every record, every witness, every trace of what happened in Blackwood County erased from history. The authorities said it was for public safety, but the truth is far more disturbing. What occurred in the coastal marshlands of South Carolina in 1807 was meant to stay hidden forever, but history has a way of preserving its darkest secrets, waiting for someone to uncover what others have tried so desperately to conceal. You're about to learn why some chapters of American history have been deliberately removed from our textbooks. The story begins not with screams or blood, but with a simple architectural anomaly. In the spring of 1803, a wealthy merchant named Thaddeus Blackwood commissioned the construction of what would become known as Blackwood Manor. The specifications were peculiar. A grand plantation house with precisely 13 rooms, each with windows positioned to capture specific angles of light during solstices and equinoxes. The local builders found the requirements strange, but not alarming. The Blackwood family had always been considered eccentric. Their fortune mysteriously accumulated during Thaddeus' years abroad in the Caribbean and Europe. What the builders couldn't have known was that the manor's unusual design wasn't merely aesthetic. It was functional. Every measurement, every angle, every stone placement served a purpose that wouldn't become apparent until years later. Thaddeus Blackwood arrived in South Carolina in 1797, though his family name was already well established in the region. His great-grandfather, Jeremiah Blackwood, had been among the first English settlers in the Carolina colony. What distinguished Thaddeus from his ancestors was not just his exceptional wealth, but the strange companions he brought with him. A French astronomer named Claude Beaumont, a German physician called Heinrich Vogel, and a silent, imposing man known only as Ishmael, who served as Blackwood's personal secretary. Together they formed what locals would later call Blackwood's Inner Circle. Their arrival marked the beginning of a transformation that would eventually consume the entire county. The official records describe Blackwood as a respected plantation owner who quickly established himself as a pillar of the community. He donated generously to the construction of churches and public buildings. He hosted elaborate dinners for the local gentry. He even served briefly as a county magistrate. But the journals of Elizabeth Carver, wife of a neighboring plantation owner, tell a different story. "There is something not right about the gatherings at Blackwood Manor," she wrote in October of 1804. "The music continues until dawn, but it is unlike any melody I have ever heard. And the strange lights in the eastern wing of the house, they pulse with a rhythm that seems almost like a heartbeat. My husband forbids me from discussing these observations with anyone else." Elizabeth Carver's journal entries become increasingly disturbed over the next 6 months. She describes servants from Blackwood Manor appearing in town with vacant expressions and no memory of recent events. She notes how the soil on Blackwood's plantation yielded crops of unprecedented abundance, despite drought conditions that devastated neighboring farms. Most disturbingly, she records the disappearance of 3 local children who were last seen near the boundaries of Blackwood's property. The official explanation that they had been taken by alligators in the swamp satisfied the authorities, but not Elizabeth. Her final journal entry, dated April 17, 1805, reads simply, "I have been invited to Blackwood Manor. I must know the truth, though Thomas warns against it. If I do not return, let it be known where I went and why." Elizabeth Carver never returned home. Her husband reported her missing the following day, but the investigation was cursory at best. Thaddeus Blackwood expressed his deepest sympathies and offered his resources to aid in the search. The local sheriff, a man who had recently built a fine new home thanks to Blackwood's generosity, concluded that Mrs. Carver had most likely become disoriented in the swamplands and drowned. Her body was never recovered. Thomas Carver sold his plantation at a fraction of its value 3 weeks later and left South Carolina, never to return. The matter might have ended there, another tragic accident in a harsh frontier environment, had it not been for Dr. James Holcomb. Dr. Holcomb arrived in Blackwood County in early 1806, a young physician educated at the University of Pennsylvania. He came at the invitation of the county's wealthy families, who sought a doctor with modern training rather than the aging local practitioner whose methods were increasingly viewed as outdated. Holcomb established his practice in the county seat and quickly earned a reputation for his skill and compassion. He was also methodical and observant, keeping detailed records of every patient he treated. It was these records that first led him to question the official narratives surrounding Blackwood Manor. "I have observed an unusual medical phenomenon among the house servants employed by Mr. Thaddeus Blackwood," Holcomb wrote in his private medical journal in June of 1806. 5 individuals, unrelated by blood, all exhibit identical physiological anomalies: abnormally slow heart rates, unusually low body temperatures, and pupils that contract rather than dilate in darkness. When questioned about these symptoms, they become agitated and unable to maintain coherent conversation. Most curiously, all 5 bear identical small scars at the base of the skull, as if from a surgical procedure none can recall undergoing. Holcomb's curiosity led him to investigate further, though discreetly. The Blackwood name carried tremendous weight in the county, and Thaddeus had integrated himself fully into the upper echelons of local society. His inner circle had expanded to include several prominent citizens: Judge William Foster, who presided over the county court; Reverend Silas Thornton, whose new church had been built with Blackwood funds; and Mayor Henry Clayton, whose daughter had recently married Blackwood's business partner. This alliance of influence made direct questioning dangerous. Instead, Holcomb began collecting folk tales and rumors from the less privileged residents of the county, particularly from the slaves whose movements through the community often rendered them invisible to the white power structure. What Holcomb uncovered was a pattern of disturbing events that coincided with Blackwood's arrival. Not just the disappearances, which numbered far more than the official records acknowledged, but stranger occurrences: livestock born with grotesque deformities, wells that ran red for days before clearing, and most alarmingly, witnesses who described seeing people known to have died months earlier walking the grounds of Blackwood Manor at night. These stories were dismissed by authorities as superstition, the primitive fears of uneducated minds. But Holcomb noted that the same essential details appeared in accounts from individuals who could not possibly have coordinated their stories. In November of 1806, Dr. Holcomb's investigations led him to an elderly slave named Solomon, who had been sold by the Blackwood family years earlier due to his advanced age and failing health. Now living in relative obscurity on a small farm 20 miles from Blackwood Manor, Solomon was willing to speak of things others dared not mention. The old master, Jeremiah Blackwood, he brought something back with him from his travels, Solomon told Holcomb. Not gold, not spices, but something else. Something he kept locked in a silver box with strange carvings. Sometimes at night, I would hear him talking to it like it was a person. After those nights, someone in the household would always take sick and die. Always. When Master Jeremiah himself finally died, his son buried that silver box with him. Or so we all thought, until young Master Thaddeus returned from his travels with that same box in his possession. This account aligned with something Holcomb had discovered in the county's historical records: an unusual number of deaths in the Blackwood household during Jeremiah's time, all attributed to various natural causes but occurring with statistical improbability. More significantly, it provided the first suggestion that whatever was happening at Blackwood Manor in the present had roots extending back generations. This was no longer simply a matter of one man's eccentricity or even criminality, but something more systematic and enduring. The turning point in Holcomb's investigation came in January of 1807, when he was called to Blackwood Manor to treat Heinrich Vogel, the German physician who had arrived with Thaddeus 4 years earlier. Vogel was suffering from advanced consumption and was not expected to survive the winter. Blackwood himself was away on business in Charleston, providing Holcomb a rare opportunity to enter the manor without its master present. What he found there defied rational explanation. Vogel, in his delirium, mistook Holcomb for Blackwood and spoke freely of their work. "The alignment is almost complete," Vogel rasped, clutching Holcomb's arm with surprising strength for a dying man. "The celestial conjunction approaches. 7 more vessels are required. No, 6, now that the carver woman has been prepared. Her resistance was impressive, but ultimately futile. When the stars align in March, the gateway will open, and they will honor our covenant as they have for 7 generations. Eternal life, Thaddeus, just as you promised me." Holcomb, maintaining his pretense, pressed for more information. Vogel's ramblings became more specific, more horrifying. He spoke of a ritual requiring 13 vessels, human sacrifices, whose prepared bodies would form a complex geometric pattern within the specially designed chambers of Blackwood Manor. He referenced an entity or entities he called only the Watchers, beings that existed in the spaces between stars who had formed a pact with Jeremiah Blackwood in 1693. In exchange for regular sacrifices and the construction of a gateway, the Watchers granted the Blackwood line, and their chosen associates extended life and influence. According to Vogel, Thaddeus was not Jeremiah's grandson, as the family claimed, but Jeremiah himself, his life unnaturally extended through the Dark Covenant. Holcomb left Blackwood Manor that night with his medical bag containing something he had never expected to acquire: Vogel's personal journal, which the dying man had insisted he take, perhaps in a moment of lucidity and remorse. Written in a cryptic combination of German, Latin, and mathematical symbols, the journal would take Holcomb weeks to decipher even partially. But its contents would confirm his worst suspicions and reveal the full extent of the horror gestating in Blackwood County. The journal detailed the true nature of what Vogel called the Blackwood Covenant. Jeremiah Blackwood, while trading in the Caribbean in the late 17th century, had encountered an ancient cult that worshipped entities they believed existed beyond the veil of known reality. These beings, neither gods nor demons but something wholly other, were said to grant boons to those who knew how to reach them. The cult had been systematically exterminated by Spanish authorities, but not before Jeremiah had learned their rituals and obtained their relic, a small figurine carved from an unknown black stone that was kept in the silver box Solomon had mentioned. Through this relic, Jeremiah had established contact with the Watchers and struck his bargain. Every generation, a new gateway would be prepared, and 13 sacrifices made according to precise specifications. In return, Jeremiah received unnaturally long life, though not true immortality. His body would eventually fail, requiring him to transfer his consciousness to a younger host, preferably his own descendant. The ritual for this transfer was detailed in Vogel's journal with clinical precision, explaining how Jeremiah had inhabited first his son's body, then his grandson's, and now lived as Thaddeus, his own great-grandson. Each transfer extended his life by decades, though at increasing cost. The journal noted that Thaddeus/Jeremiah was beginning to show signs of physical and mental deterioration, making the upcoming ritual in March 1807 particularly crucial. But the full scope of the covenant went beyond one man's unnatural longevity. The Watchers required not just sacrifices, but influence, the subtle shaping of human society according to their incomprehensible design. Through his consecutive identities, Jeremiah had established a network of power across South Carolina and beyond, placing acolytes in positions of authority and eliminating those who posed threats. The Blackwood cult, as Holcomb came to call it, had tentacles reaching into government, law enforcement, business, and even the church. Its members were bound by blood rituals, mutual self-interest, and the promise of extended life for the most devoted adherents. Most disturbing was Vogel's description of the imminent ritual planned for March 20th, 1807, the spring equinox. This would be no ordinary sacrifice, but the culmination of Blackwood's decades-long work. The 13 vessels were not merely to be killed, but transformed through a process Vogel had helped perfect, their bodies and minds altered to serve as conduits. The gateway, for which Blackwood Manor had been specifically designed, would open fully, allowing the Watchers partial entry into our reality. What would follow was described in terms so abhorrent that Holcomb could not bring himself to transcribe them fully in his own notes, referring only to a rebirth that will unmake all that we know and establish a new dominion. By February of 1807, Holcomb knew he had to act, but his options were severely limited. The local authorities were either cult members or under Blackwood's influence. Writing to officials in Charleston would take too long, assuming his letters weren't intercepted. Attempting to warn the community would likely result in his immediate discreditation or elimination. With no clear recourse through official channels, Holcomb made a desperate decision. He would attempt to find and rescue the intended sacrifices, then destroy the gateway himself. Vogel's journal had included a list of the vessels already acquired. 8 individuals were being held somewhere on the Blackwood property, including Elizabeth Carver, who had apparently been kept alive for almost 2 years. 5 more were to be collected before the equinox. Holcomb recognized several names on the future acquisition list, including his own housekeeper's 12-year-old son. The specific requirements for the sacrifices followed a pattern that mixed bloodlines, ages, and physical attributes according to some arcane formula Holcomb couldn't fully decipher. What was clear, however, was that Blackwood would be making his move to collect these final vessels soon. On February 23, 1807, Holcomb visited the small farm where Solomon, the elderly former Blackwood slave, was living. He hoped the old man might know where on the vast Blackwood property the captives could be held. What he found at the farm was a scene of carnage. Solomon had been killed with methodical brutality, his body arranged in a specific position with symbols carved into his flesh. The silver box Solomon had mentioned was nowhere to be found, but a message had been left at the scene, not written, but formed from small bones arranged on the floor. "Physician, heal thyself." The message was clear. Blackwood knew of Holcomb's investigation and was sending a warning, but the doctor was beyond intimidation now. The ritual was less than a month away, and innocent lives hung in the balance. If Blackwood succeeded, the consequences would extend far beyond 13 murders. According to Vogel's journal, the opening of the gateway would create a permanent foothold for the Watchers in our world, expanding their influence exponentially. What began in a remote South Carolina county would eventually consume the young American nation and beyond. Holcomb spent the next week in feverish preparation, gathering what weapons he could discreetly acquire and studying Vogel's journal for any weakness in the Covenant's design. He identified a critical vulnerability. The ritual required perfect alignment, both celestial and geometric. If even one vessel was out of position, or if the gateway's physical structure was damaged, the entire process would collapse, possibly with catastrophic consequences for the cult members. The journal hinted that failed rituals in previous generations had resulted in the horrific deaths of all involved, with only Jeremiah/Thaddeus protected by his special relationship with the Watchers. On March 10th, just 10 days before the planned ritual, Holcomb noticed he was being followed, subtle at first. A glimpse of the same figure at different locations throughout the day. Items in his office slightly moved when he returned from house calls. Then more overt. A dead raven left on his doorstep, its wings arranged in the same pattern as the symbols carved into Solomon's body. A patient canceling an appointment because "A gentleman advised me to avoid your care for the time being." Rather than deterring Holcomb, these intimidation tactics only confirmed that he was running out of time to act. On March 15th, Holcomb received an unexpected visitor, Ishmael, Blackwood's silent secretary. The imposing man entered Holcomb's office after hours, moving with unnatural stillness. For the first time in anyone's memory, Ishmael spoke, his voice deep and strangely accented. "Dr. Holcomb, my master extends an invitation to dine at Blackwood Manor tomorrow evening. He wishes to discuss certain medical theories that may interest you." The message delivered, Ishmael departed without awaiting a response. It was clearly not an invitation, but a summons, and potentially a trap. Yet it might also be Holcomb's only opportunity to access the manor and locate the captives. Holcomb spent a sleepless night weighing his options. In the morning, he wrote a detailed account of everything he had discovered, sealed it in an envelope addressed to his former professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and gave it to a trusted patient who was departing for Philadelphia that day. Then he prepared for dinner with the architect of a multi-generational atrocity. Blackwood Manor by daylight presented a facade of genteel southern elegance. Its white columns and expansive veranda revealed nothing of its true purpose. Holcomb was received with exquisite courtesy by Thaddeus Blackwood himself, a tall, slender man who appeared to be in his mid-50s, but whose eyes reflected decades more experience. "Dr. Holcomb, what a pleasure to finally have an extended conversation. Your reputation for both skill and curiosity precedes you." Blackwood's voice was cultured, his manners impeccable. Only the unnatural stillness with which he held himself, similar to Ishmael's strange deportment, suggested anything abnormal. The dinner was attended by several other guests, all members of Blackwood's inner circle. Judge Foster was there, as was Reverend Thornton and Mayor Clayton. The conversation flowed naturally through politics, literature, and local affairs, with no hint of the cult's true activities. Holcomb maintained his composure, playing the role of the flattered young physician pleased to be in such distinguished company. He accepted wine but was careful to drink minimally, conscious of the risk of drugging. As the meal progressed, he found opportunities to glance beyond the dining room, mentally mapping the manor's layout against what he had gleaned from Vogel's journal. After dinner, Blackwood invited Holcomb to his private study for brandy and more stimulating conversation. The room was dominated by unusual astronomical instruments and bookshelves filled with ancient volumes in various languages. A large star chart covered one wall, with specific celestial alignments marked in red ink. Blackwood noticed Holcomb's interest in the chart and smiled thinly. The heavens hold more power than most modern men of science are willing to acknowledge. Wouldn't you agree, Doctor? What followed was the most extraordinary and disturbing conversation of Holcomb's life. Without explicitly acknowledging his true identity as Jeremiah, Blackwood spoke of the limitations of the human lifespan as a problem I have been working to solve for quite some time. He described his travels in the Caribbean, Africa, and the Far East, spanning periods that would have been impossible for a man of Thaddeus's apparent age. He referenced historical events from the late 17th century with the intimacy of personal experience. Gradually, the pretense of normalcy fell away. "You have been quite persistent in your investigations, Dr. Holcomb," Blackwood said, swirling his brandy. "Most men would have retreated at the first sign of discouragement. Your resilience suggests an uncommon mind, one that might be receptive to certain truths ordinary people cannot comprehend." Blackwood then made his proposition. Holcomb could join the inner circle, adding his medical expertise to their great work. In exchange, he would receive knowledge and longevity beyond mortal limitations. "And if I decline this generous offer?" Holcomb asked, maintaining his composure despite his internal revulsion. Blackwood's smile didn't waver. "Then you will still contribute to our work, albeit in a more passive capacity. Your name is actually quite high on our list of potential vessels. Your years of medical training have created neural pathways that would be particularly receptive to the Watcher's influence. In fact, your brain would make an exceptional gateway component." The threat was delivered with such casual elegance that its horror was almost obscured. Blackwood gave Holcomb until the following evening to consider the proposal, though both men understood it was not truly a choice. As Holcomb was escorted from the study, Blackwood added one final comment. "Your housekeeper's son was acquired this afternoon, by the way. A remarkable boy. His role in the pattern is pivotal." Holcomb returned to town with his mind racing. The situation was even worse than he had feared. Not only was Blackwood aware of his investigation, but the final vessels were already being collected. The ritual was clearly proceeding on schedule. As he approached his home, Holcomb noticed his housekeeper, Mrs. Miller, waiting on his porch. Her face was twisted with grief. "They took him." She sobbed when she saw Holcomb. "Men came and said the mayor wanted to see Daniel, that he was going to offer him a position as a houseboy. But when I went to the mayor's house to check on him, they said he had never been there. He's gone, Doctor. My boy is gone." This confirmation of Blackwood's taunt eliminated any remaining doubt in Holcomb's mind. He had less than 5 days to stop the ritual, with no allies, and against an enemy with generations of influence and supernatural assistance. His medical bag contained a revolver he had acquired the previous week, 6 bullets against an enemy of unknown number and nature. The odds were impossible, but the stakes allowed no retreat. That night, as Holcomb considered his limited options, he received another unexpected visitor. Claude Beaumont, the French astronomer from Blackwood's inner circle, appeared at his door shortly before midnight. Unlike Ishmael's mechanical stillness or Blackwood's predatory elegance, Beaumont exhibited visible agitation. "I can speak only briefly," he whispered after Holcomb let him in. "They will notice my absence soon. But you must know, there is dissension within the circle. Vogel's death has changed the dynamic. Some of us have begun to question whether the Watcher's promises are genuine." According to Beaumont, Blackwood had become increasingly unstable, his moments of lucidity interrupted by periods where he seemed to be conversing with entities no one else could perceive. The coming ritual would be different from previous iterations, more ambitious and potentially more devastating. He speaks not merely of extending his life again, but of becoming something new entirely. The vessels are being prepared differently. The patterns have been altered. Even I, who have calculated the celestial alignments for decades, cannot predict the outcome of these changes. Most significantly, Beaumont revealed the location of the captives. They were being held not in the manor itself, but in a specially constructed chamber beneath the family mausoleum on the eastern edge of the Blackwood property. The entrance is hidden behind the tomb of the first Jeremiah, Beaumont explained. A series of tunnels connects it to the manor's eastern wing. That is how they will be brought to the gateway chamber when the time comes. Before departing, Beaumont gave Holcomb one final piece of information. The ritual required Blackwood's complete focus and energy. It would leave him vulnerable in ways he normally was not. For a brief window, he will be as mortal as any man, Beaumont whispered. If you truly wish to end this, that is your moment. With that, the astronomer slipped out into the night, his future as uncertain as Holcomb's own. The next day, Holcomb made his preparations. He told no one of his plans, knowing that word might get back to Blackwood. He visited several patients, wrote letters to family members, and put his affairs in order with quiet determination. When evening came, he did not go to Blackwood Manor as instructed. Instead, he waited until well after midnight before making his way on horseback to the Blackwood family mausoleum. The moon was waning, providing just enough light to navigate, but also casting deep shadows among the ancient oak trees surrounding the burial ground. The mausoleum was an imposing structure of pale marble, designed in the classical style, but with subtle architectural modifications similar to those Holcomb had observed in the manor house. Strange angles and proportions that seemed slightly wrong to the human eye. Following Beaumont's instructions, Holcomb located the tomb of the first Jeremiah, or what was publicly known as the first Jeremiah. The stone was worn, but bore the date 1722, marking the supposed death of Blackwood's great-grandfather. The hidden mechanism took Holcomb several tense minutes to activate. When it finally gave way, a portion of the stone floor slid back to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was stale and carried a medical smell Holcomb recognized, a mixture of chloroform, alcohol, and something else, something metallic and organic that made his stomach clench. Lighting the small lantern he had brought, Holcomb began his descent into the Blackwood family's true legacy. The staircase led to a tunnel roughly hewn from the clay soil, reinforced with wooden beams. The passage extended forward into darkness, curving gradually in what Holcomb presumed was the direction of the manor house. But Beaumont had indicated that the captives were being held in chambers directly beneath the mausoleum. After approximately 50 feet, Holcomb discovered a heavy iron door set into the left wall of the tunnel. It was secured with an elaborate lock, but the key was hanging from a hook beside it, a sign of the cult's confidence in their security. Beyond the door lay a scene from a nightmare. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with 13 alcoves. In each alcove was a stone table, and on 8 of those tables lay human forms in various stages of what could only be described as transformation. They were restrained with leather straps, intravenous tubes running from their arms to glass containers hung above each table. Some appeared unconscious, others in a state of half-awareness, their eyes following Holcomb as he entered, but unable to speak or move beyond feeble twitching. Holcomb recognized Elizabeth Carver, though he would not have known her if not for the small nameplate at the foot of her table. After nearly 2 years in captivity, her appearance had been dramatically altered. Her skin had taken on a gray, almost translucent quality, the veins beneath visible and pulsing with a liquid that seemed darker than blood. Surgical incisions along her skull had healed into precise patterns of scarring, and her eyes had changed color, now an unsettling amber that reflected Holcomb's lantern light like a cat's. The other captives were in similar conditions, though at different stages of the process. Daniel Miller, Mrs. Miller's 12-year-old son, had apparently been recently acquired and showed the least modification, though his small body was already connected to the intravenous apparatus. Holcomb moved quickly to the boy's side, checking his vital signs and finding him deeply sedated but otherwise physically intact. The other victims were less fortunate. Some had been altered so extensively that their humanity was in question. their bodies reshaping according to some alien design. Holcomb faced an impossible decision. He could not hope to rescue all 8 captives. Most were too extensively modified to survive removal from the apparatus sustaining them. Even if he could somehow move them, transporting multiple incapacitated individuals without detection was beyond his capability. With grief and pragmatism warring in his mind, Holcomb focused on Daniel, carefully removing the intravenous lines and administering a small dose of stimulant from his medical bag to counteract the sedation. As he worked to free the boy from his restraints, Holcomb became aware of a sound from the tunnel outside, footsteps approaching with unhurried confidence. He quickly extinguished his lantern and drew his revolver, positioning himself in the shadows beside the door. When it opened, Ishmael's tall figure was silhouetted in the dim light from the tunnel. Holcomb acted without hesitation, striking the man at the base of the skull with the butt of his revolver, putting all his strength into the blow. To Holcomb's horror, Ishmael did not fall. He turned slowly, seeming more curious than injured, and reached for the doctor with hands that suddenly appeared too long, the fingers extending like pale branches. Holcomb fired his revolver point-blank into Ishmael's chest. The impact staggered the man back a step, but no blood appeared from the wound. Instead, the entry point seemed to close immediately, the flesh rippling like disturbed water. "Dr. Holcomb," Ishmael said in his deep, strange voice, "your presence is unexpected but not unwelcome. The Master will be pleased to add you to our collection earlier than planned." As he spoke, his features began to shift subtly, becoming less human with each passing second. His jaw extended beyond normal proportions, and his eyes receded into shadowed sockets that seemed to deepen endlessly. Holcomb fired again, aiming for Ishmael's head. This shot had more effect, causing the creature to emit a high-pitched sound beyond the range of human vocalization. Black fluid leaked from the wound, sizzling where it touched the stone floor. Ishmael staggered, his form becoming increasingly unstable, parts of his body seeming to fade in and out of solidity. Holcomb used the opportunity to grab the still groggy Daniel and push past the wounded entity, pulling the boy into the tunnel. "Run for the stairs," Holcomb commanded, knowing the partially sedated child would still move faster alone than if Holcomb tried to carry him. "Get to the surface and keep running. Don't stop until you reach town." He pressed his remaining money into the boy's hand. "Find Reverend Wilson at the Methodist Church. Not Thornton, do you understand? Wilson. Tell him everything you've seen." Daniel, though disoriented, nodded and began moving toward the staircase, his steps becoming steadier as the stimulant took full effect. Holcomb turned back to face Ishmael, who had followed them into the tunnel, his movements jerky and unpredictable as his form continued to degrade from the head wound. Holcomb fired a third shot, again striking the entity's head and causing further destabilization. Ishmael collapsed to his knees, his body seeming to fold in on itself in anatomically impossible ways, still reaching for Holcomb with limbs that now resembled tentacles more than human arms. With Ishmael temporarily incapacitated, Holcomb had a choice: escape with Daniel, or continue deeper into the tunnel toward the manor and the gateway chamber. The ritual was still days away. He could flee now, take Daniel to safety, and return with help, assuming he could convince anyone of what he'd witnessed. But Beaumont's warning echoed in his mind. Blackwood was making changes to the ritual, accelerating processes that had previously taken generations. There was no certainty that the equinox timeline remained in effect, and now that his presence was known, the element of surprise was lost. Holcomb made his decision. "Run, Daniel," he repeated, giving the boy a gentle push toward the stairs. "Tell them everything." Then he turned and began moving deeper into the tunnel, toward Blackwood Manor, and whatever abomination awaited at its heart. Behind him, he could hear Ishmael's unnatural movements resuming, following at an unhurried pace, as if certain of the outcome, regardless of Holcomb's choices. The tunnel extended for nearly half a mile, gradually widening and becoming more finished in its construction as it approached the manor. Gas lamps appeared at regular intervals, illuminating the passage with a sickly blue-tinged light. Holcomb moved as quietly as possible, knowing that Ishmael was somewhere behind him and uncertain what might lie ahead. The air grew increasingly thick with strange odors, chemical components Holcomb recognized from his medical training mixed with something else, something organic yet utterly alien to his experience. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber directly beneath the eastern wing of Blackwood Manor. Here, the true purpose of the house's unusual architecture became apparent. The chamber was a perfect circle, its ceiling designed so that 13 shafts extended upward into the manor, one connecting to each of the specially positioned rooms above. The walls were covered in complex astronomical charts and mathematical formulae, some written in standard notation, but many in symbols Holcomb had never encountered before. At the center of the chamber stood a raised platform supporting what could only be the gateway, a structure combining aspects of an astronomical instrument, a medical operating theater, and a religious altar. The gateway's framework was metal, but not any alloy Holcomb recognized. It had a dull, almost organic quality that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the chamber's light. Within this framework was suspended a black stone object about the size of a man's head, presumably an enlarged version of the figurine Jeremiah had originally acquired from the Caribbean cult. The stone was not simply dark, but seemed to consume light, creating a visual void in the center of the structure. Most disturbing were the numerous surgical instruments arranged around the platform, many connected to brass and glass mechanisms of unknown purpose. Holcomb had expected to find the chamber empty, the ritual preparations still in progress. Instead, he discovered Thaddeus Blackwood standing at the gateway, making adjustments to the instruments with focused intensity. The man's movements were precise, but strangely arrhythmic, as if each action required separate conscious control rather than flowing naturally. When he sensed Holcomb's presence, Blackwood turned without surprise. "Ah, Dr. Holcomb, you've saved me the trouble of having you collected." His voice had changed since their dinner conversation, now containing harmonics that seemed to bypass the ear and resonate directly within the brain. "Though I see you've interfered with my vessel collection, the Miller boy was perfectly calibrated for position 9 in the array. His absence will require compensations." Holcomb raised his revolver, aiming at Blackwood's heart. "This ends now," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Whatever you're planning, whatever entity you serve, it stops here." Blackwood's smile was terrible in its serenity. "My dear doctor, you mistake the nature of our relationship. The Watchers do not demand service. They offer partnership. For 7 generations, my family has benefited from their guidance. The limitations of human existence, disease, aging, death, these are merely design flaws to be corrected. What you perceive as monstrosity is simply evolution directed by superior intelligence." As Blackwood spoke, Holcomb noticed subtle changes in the man's appearance. His skin seemed to ripple occasionally, as if something moved beneath its surface. His eyes, previously dark brown, now held the same amber quality Holcomb had observed in Elizabeth Carver and the other vessels. Most disturbingly, the proportions of his face seemed fluid, features shifting subtly in ways that should have been impossible for human physiology. "You're not human anymore," Holcomb said, his medical training helping him maintain analytical distance despite his horror. "Whatever consciousness inhabits that body, it's not Thaddeus Blackwood, or even Jeremiah." "Perceptive," Blackwood acknowledged, his smile widening beyond natural limits. "The transfer process improves with each iteration. The first vessels, my son, my grandson, they retained too much of their original personalities, creating internal conflict. By the time I inhabited Thaddeus, I had refined the technique, and now, with the Watcher's guidance, I am becoming something unprecedented. Neither fully human nor fully Watcher, but a perfect synthesis, the first of a new species that will eventually replace humanity entirely." Holcomb's finger tightened on the trigger. "And the 13 sacrifices? The people you've tortured and transformed, what role do they play in your evolution?" "Conduits," Blackwood replied simply. "The human nervous system, properly modified, creates pathways between realities. 13 calibrated vessels, positioned precisely according to celestial alignments, generate a stable connection through which the Watchers can extend their influence. Previous rituals created temporary apertures, enough to communicate, to exchange knowledge and certain energies. But this ritual will establish permanent residence. The gateway, once fully activated, cannot be closed. The implications were staggering. Holcomb had assumed he was dealing with a cult leader's delusions, or at most some localized supernatural phenomenon. But Blackwood was describing something far more comprehensive. An invasion using human bodies as its beachhead. Why South Carolina? Why here? Blackwood gestured to the astronomical charts covering the walls. Geography aligns with celestial forces in ways your science has yet to comprehend. This location sits at a conjunction of terrestrial energy currents. Combined with the specific celestial alignment occurring this equinox, an alignment that happens once every 333 years, it creates ideal conditions for the transition. The Watchers have been patient. They have waited centuries for this precise moment. As Blackwood spoke, Holcomb became aware of movement behind him. Ishmael had followed him through the tunnel, the entity's form now barely recognizable as human. Behind Ishmael came other figures: Judge Foster, Reverend Thornton, Mayor Clayton, and several others Holcomb recognized as prominent county citizens. All moved with the same unnatural cadence, their faces displaying varying degrees of transformation similar to Blackwood's. The inner circle had assembled, and Holcomb was surrounded. "Your revolver contains 3 remaining bullets, Dr. Holcomb," Blackwood observed casually. "Even if you were to use them with perfect accuracy, which I doubt, you would hardly inconvenience us. Conventional weapons cause temporary disruption at most, as you discovered with Ishmael. We are already more than human." Holcomb knew Blackwood was right. The gun provided no real protection against whatever these entities had become. But Vogel's journal had mentioned the ritual's vulnerability, its need for perfect alignment, and complete focus from its participants. If Holcomb could create enough disruption at the critical moment, perhaps the consequences would destroy the cult entirely. But the equinox was still days away. He needed to survive long enough to interfere when it mattered. "I have a counterproposal," Holcomb said, lowering his weapon slightly but keeping it ready. "You've lost one vessel. The Miller boy is beyond your reach now, and finding a replacement with the specific qualities you need would be difficult in the time remaining. You need a medical expert to help compensate for this discrepancy, someone who understands human physiology well enough to make the necessary adjustments to your remaining vessels. I'm offering my services." Blackwood tilted his head, the motion unsettlingly bird-like. "You would join us voluntarily? After all your moral outrage?" "Not join you," Holcomb clarified. "Work for you, temporarily. In exchange for my own life and a guarantee that no further vessels will be collected from the county population, you have 12. Make do with 12. The assembled cult members exchanged glances, communicating in some manner beyond normal human perception. Finally, Blackwood spoke. "Your proposal has merit, though your motivation is transparent. You hope to sabotage our work from within. Nevertheless, your medical expertise would be valuable, particularly for the final calibration phase, and we can take precautions against betrayal." What followed was the strangest negotiation of Holcomb's life, a bargain with entities that were neither fully human nor fully other, conducted in the shadowy chamber beneath Blackwood Manor, while surrounded by the instruments of an abominable ritual. In the end, a compromise was reached. Holcomb would assist with the medical aspects of preparing the remaining vessels, applying his knowledge to help compensate for the missing 13th. In exchange, his life would be spared, and no new victims would be taken from the local population. Both parties knew the agreement was temporary and tactical. Holcomb sought only to buy time and gain access, while the cult needed his expertise to salvage their ritual. The true intentions on both sides remained unspoken but mutually understood. What neither side acknowledged was how exposure to the gateway might affect a human who had not undergone the preliminary transformations, a question that would become significant in the days ahead. For the next 3 days, Holcomb lived and worked in the chamber beneath Blackwood Manor, sleeping only in brief intervals under guard. He was permitted access to the vessels, ostensibly to monitor their condition and make adjustments to their transformative protocols. What his captors didn't realize was that during these examinations, Holcomb was secretly administering compounds from his medical bag, subtle pharmacological interventions designed to counteract the most extreme aspects of the vessels, modifications. He couldn't reverse the process entirely. The changes were too extensive and too alien for his medical knowledge to fully comprehend, let alone undo. But he could introduce elements of instability into the system, chemical imbalances that might disrupt the perfect synchronization required for the ritual. It was sabotage on a molecular level, invisible to observation but potentially catastrophic in its cumulative effect. During this time, Holcomb also learned more about the true nature of Blackwood's cult and its history. The Inner Circle members, during their periods of activity in the chamber, spoke freely in his presence, apparently unconcerned that their secrets were being shared with a man they assumed would not live beyond the ritual. They discussed previous iterations of the Covenant, naming prominent historical figures who had been secret adherents across generations. They referenced other gateway sites around the world, less powerful than the Blackwood location, but still serving as conduits for the Watchers' influence. Most disturbingly, they spoke of a broader strategy spanning centuries. The South Carolina site was merely one component of a global design, its activation intended to trigger a cascade of similar events across the planet. The spring equinox of 1807 had been selected not just for its celestial significance, but because it corresponded with political and social conditions. The Watchers had been subtly engineering through their human partners. The young American Republic, with its idealism and lack of entrenched traditions, was particularly vulnerable to infiltration. Once established here, the Watchers' influence could spread throughout the new nation's developing institutions. As the equinox approached, Holcomb observed increasing instability in Blackwood himself. The man's transformations were becoming more pronounced and less controlled. During periods of intense activity, his features would shift dramatically, sometimes revealing glimpses of something underneath that bore no resemblance to human anatomy. His speech patterns alternated between his original cultured diction and something more alien, syntactical structures that seemed to bypass normal cognitive processing and implant concepts directly into the listener's mind. Beaumont, the French astronomer who had helped Holcomb, maintained a careful distance during this period. His position within the cult appeared increasingly precarious as Blackwood's suspicions grew. On the eve of the equinox, Beaumont managed a brief, whispered conversation with Holcomb while adjusting one of the astronomical instruments. "The alignment is wrong," he murmured, his eyes darting nervously toward Blackwood. "The calculations were perfect, but something has changed. The celestial bodies are not where they should be. I've tried to tell him, but he won't listen. He says the Watchers have adjusted the heavens themselves to accommodate his modifications. It's madness. This ritual won't create a gateway. It will create something far worse." Before Holcomb could press for details, Ishmael appeared behind Beaumont, placing an elongated hand on the astronomer's shoulder. "The Master requires your presence," the entity said in its resonant voice. Beaumont gave Holcomb one last significant look before being led away. It was the last time Holcomb would see him alive. The day of the equinox began with a disturbing discovery. During his morning inspection of the vessels, Holcomb found Elizabeth Carver fully conscious for the first time since his arrival. Her amber eyes tracked his movements with awareness that had been absent before. When he leaned close to check her vital signs, she spoke, her voice barely audible and distorted by the changes to her vocal anatomy. "Doctor," she rasped, "you must destroy us all, every vessel. It's the only way. We are already gone, but something is using our bodies, our memories. Something is wearing us like clothing." Her words came in painful bursts between labored breaths. "I've seen what waits on the other side of the gateway. It's not what Blackwood believes. The Watchers have been lying to him for generations. They don't want to elevate humanity, they want to consume it. Please, end this, end us." Holcomb was still processing this plea when alarms sounded throughout the chamber. The cult members rushed to their stations, checking instruments and consulting charts. Blackwood strode into the center of the activity, his movements now completely inhuman, a fluid gliding that seemed to defy gravitational limitations. "It begins," he announced, his voice overlaid with harmonics that caused physical pain in Holcomb's ears. "The celestial alignment approaches its apex. Prepare the vessels for ascension." What followed was a choreographed chaos of activity. The vessels were disconnected from their sustaining apparatus and moved to the main chamber, each placed on a specific point of an intricate pattern inlaid into the floor. Holcomb was instructed to monitor their vital functions during the transfer, ensuring none expired before the ritual reached its critical phase. He complied outwardly, while looking for any opportunity to disrupt the proceedings. As the vessels were positioned, a change came over the gateway structure. The black stone at its center began to emit a sound beyond the range of human hearing, but perceptible as a pressure inside the skull. The metal framework vibrated in response, generating harmonics that resonated with the stone. The gas lamps throughout the chamber flickered, their blue flames elongating unnaturally and bending toward the gateway as if drawn by an unseen force. Blackwood took his position at the head of the pattern, standing on a raised platform directly aligned with the gateway. The other cult members formed a secondary pattern around the vessels, each holding instruments that Holcomb recognized from Vogel's journal as components of the activation sequence. Ishmael brought forward a silver box, the original container of the figurine Jeremiah had acquired centuries earlier, now used in some ceremonial capacity within the ritual. "The alignment reaches perfection in 3 minutes," announced one of the cult members, consulting an astronomical instrument. "The vessels are stable, but showing signs of accelerated transformation." Holcomb, positioned near Elizabeth Carver's prone form, observed with clinical detachment that all 12 vessels were indeed undergoing rapid changes. Their bodies contorted, skin rippling as internal structures realigned. Elizabeth's final words echoed in his mind as he watched the woman who had once been a plantation owner's wife transform into something that no longer belonged to any terrestrial species. The hospital-like atmosphere of clinical procedure made the horror all the more profound. This abomination was being conducted with the precision and care of a medical operation. As the ritual approached its climax, Holcomb made his move. The sabotage he had introduced into the vessels, biochemistry was taking effect, creating irregularities in their transformations. But it wasn't enough to stop the process entirely. He needed a more direct intervention. When the cult members were focused on Blackwood's invocation, a chant in a language that seemed to distort the air around it, Holcomb reached into his medical bag and removed a small glass vial he had prepared the previous night, a concentrated solution of the same compounds he had been secretly administering, but in a dose high enough to be immediately fatal. Elizabeth Carver's eyes found his as he uncorked the vial. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. Holcomb poured the solution into the intravenous line still connected to her arm, then moved quickly to the next vessel, repeating the process. He had managed to reach 4 of the 12 when Ishmael noticed his actions. The entity moved with blinding speed, crossing the chamber and seizing Holcomb's arm before he could administer the solution to the 5th vessel. "The doctor attempts sabotage," Ishmael announced, his grip tightening until bones cracked in Holcomb's wrist, causing him to drop the vial. It shattered on the stone floor, its contents sizzling like acid. Blackwood paused in his invocation, turning to regard Holcomb with eyes that now glowed with amber light. "Your betrayal is anticipated, but poorly timed, Dr. Holcomb. The alignment is already in progress. Even with 4 vessels compromised, the gateway will open. The only difference will be in stability, which means considerably more danger for everyone in this chamber, including yourself." As if to confirm Blackwood's words, the 4 vessels Holcomb had poisoned began to convulse violently, their transformations accelerating beyond the controlled patterns observed in the others. Elizabeth Carver's body arched impossibly, her spine bending backward until it should have snapped. But instead it seemed to reshape itself, additional vertebrae forming visibly beneath her skin. The other poisoned vessels underwent similar grotesque metamorphoses, their humanity dissolving completely as the Watchers' influence reshaped them, without the moderating effect of the cult's careful protocols. The disruption spread to the gateway itself, the black stone's vibrations becoming erratic, the metal framework bending in ways that defied material properties. The pressure inside Holcomb's skull intensified, and he noticed blood beginning to seep from the eyes and ears of some of the lesser cult members. Blackwood, however, appeared unaffected, his expression one of rapturous anticipation. "It comes," Blackwood said, raising his arms toward the gateway. "The doorway opens. The merger begins. After 7 generations of preparation, the Watchers walk among us. The chamber's illumination changed, the blue gas lamps fading as a new light source emerged, the gateway itself now emitting a radiance unlike anything in the natural spectrum. It cast no shadows, seeming instead to reveal layers of reality normally hidden from human perception. In this light, the true nature of the cult members became apparent. They were no longer merely humans with subtle alterations, but composite beings, their original forms serving as hosts for something that coexisted within the same space, entities that became visible in the gateway's illumination. Holcomb, despite his scientific rationality, found himself facing undeniable evidence of something beyond conventional understanding. The Watchers, as revealed in the gateway's light, defied description in human language. They occupied dimensions adjacent to normal reality, their forms suggesting geometries that caused physical pain to observe. They had indeed been using human hosts as vessels, but not in the way Blackwood believed. They weren't partners in ascension, but parasites, gradually hollowing out their human containers to make space for their own essence. And now, with the gateway approaching full activation, they were beginning to enter this reality in greater numbers. The air around the central structure distorted as shapes pushed through from somewhere else, somewhere that operated according to different physical laws. The 4 destabilized vessels, including Elizabeth Carver, were the first to be fully claimed. Their bodies split open along previously invisible seams, revealing masses of tissue that reorganized into configurations that accommodated the Watchers' manifestation. Blackwood observed this process with growing confusion, his expression shifting from triumph to uncertainty. This was clearly not the ascension he had anticipated. Instead of merging harmoniously with the Watchers' essence, the vessels were being consumed and repurposed. "This is wrong," he said, his voice losing its otherworldly harmonics as genuine human fear broke through. The covenant promised partnership, not possession. We were to become like gods together. The entity that had been Ishmael still gripped Holcomb's broken wrist, but was now focused on the gateway, its attention divided. Holcomb used this opportunity to reach for his revolver with his uninjured hand. He had 3 bullets remaining, and a chamber filled with interdimensional horrors beyond his comprehension. But Elizabeth's final request echoed in his mind. Destroy the vessels. End the connection. With scientific detachment, he identified the critical components of the system, the vessels themselves already beyond saving, the gateway structure too alien to understand fully, and Blackwood, the linchpin who had maintained the covenant for generations. Holcomb made his choice. He fired his first shot not at Ishmael or the manifesting Watchers, but at the astronomical instrument controlling the gateway's alignment. The delicate mechanism shattered, its calibrations instantly lost. The effect was immediate. The gateway's light fluctuated, its vibrations becoming chaotic. The partially manifested Watchers emitted sounds that transcended normal auditory range, causing several of the lesser cult members to collapse with blood pouring from their ears. Ishmael released Holcomb, turning its attention fully to the destabilizing gateway. This gave Holcomb the opening he needed. He aimed his second shot at Blackwood, striking the cult leader in the center of his chest. As Beaumont had suggested, Blackwood was indeed vulnerable during the ritual. The bullet's impact drove him backward, away from his position at the head of the pattern. Blood that seemed too dark and too viscous to be human seeped from the wound. "You cannot stop it now," Blackwood gasped, clutching his chest. "The gateway is open. The pattern is broken. Do you understand what that means? Not closure, but collapse. Not rejection, but uncontrolled manifestation. You haven't prevented an invasion. You've ensured that it will be chaotic rather than ordered." The chamber was descending into pandemonium. The surviving vessels writhed in their positions, their transformations continuing without guidance. The cult members who remained conscious were either trying to flee or attempting futilely to restore order to the ritual. The gateway itself had become a swirling vortex of the strange light, its structure beginning to warp and dissolve as the boundaries between realities broke down. Holcomb knew Blackwood was right. He hadn't stopped the Watchers. He had merely disrupted the controlled manner of their arrival. But Elizabeth's words suggested this might still be preferable to the alternative. If the Watchers required specific conditions for stable manifestation, perhaps an uncontrolled collapse of the gateway would force them back to their own reality, at least temporarily. With his final bullet, Holcomb took aim at the black stone at the gateway's center, the original artifact that had connected Jeremiah Blackwood to the Watchers generations ago. He fired, and for a moment it seemed the bullet would pass through the stone without effect. Then, with a sound beyond description, the stone fractured. The crack spread slowly at first, then accelerated. Lines of division multiplying exponentially until the entire artifact collapsed into dust. The consequence was immediate and catastrophic. The gateway's light inverted, becoming a void that consumed illumination rather than emitting it. The chamber plunged into absolute darkness for 3 heartbeats, then exploded into blinding radiance as energy released in all directions. Holcomb was thrown against the wall, his consciousness flickering as the concussive force overwhelmed his senses. His last clear vision was of Blackwood being lifted from the floor by unseen forces, his body elongating impossibly as something within him fought to maintain its connection to this reality, while something else, perhaps the last remnant of his human consciousness, fought equally hard to sever it. Then darkness claimed everything. Holcomb awakened to the sensation of raindrops on his face. He was lying on the ground outside, the night sky visible above him. The air smelled of smoke and a charred organic odor he recognized from battlefield hospitals. Every part of his body ached, and his right wrist throbbed with the distinctive pain of broken bones. But he was alive, a fact that surprised him given his last memories. As his vision cleared, Holcomb realized he was not alone. Daniel Miller knelt beside him, the boy's face streaked with soot, but otherwise unharmed. Behind Daniel stood a group of men holding torches and weapons, a hastily assembled militia from town. Among them was Reverend Wilson from the Methodist Church, the man Holcomb had instructed Daniel to find. "He's awake," Daniel called to the others. Then, to Holcomb, "You saved me, Dr. Holcomb. I did what you said. I ran to town and told Reverend Wilson everything. He believed me when no one else would." Holcomb tried to sit up, pain lancing through his body with the movement. Reverend Wilson stepped forward to assist him. "Easy, Doctor. You've been through an ordeal none of us can fully comprehend. The boy told us a tale so fantastic we would have dismissed it entirely, if not for the respected source." "How did you find me?" Holcomb managed to ask, his voice raw as if from screaming. "We followed the boy's directions to the mausoleum," Wilson explained. "Found the hidden entrance just as he described, but the tunnel had collapsed about 100 yards in. We were debating how to proceed when the entire ground shook like Judgment Day itself had arrived. A light like nothing I've ever witnessed shot up from where Blackwood Manor stood, I should say." Holcomb turned to look in the direction Wilson indicated. Where the grand plantation house had once dominated the landscape, only smoking ruins remained. The eastern wing had completely disappeared, leaving a crater of significant depth. The rest of the structure had collapsed or burned. Scattered across the grounds were the bodies of what appeared to be plantation staff, who had either fled the destruction or been thrown clear by the force of whatever had occurred. The explosion, or whatever it was, seemed to clear some of the tunnel blockage. Wilson continued. "We found you unconscious but alive, carried here by what looked like the collapse of a secondary tunnel that opened to the surface. As for the others—" The Reverend's voice trailed off, his expression troubled. "There were no others," Holcomb said firmly, meeting Wilson's eyes with an intensity that communicated more than his words. "Only victims who couldn't be saved. No one to rescue or recover." Wilson held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "As you say, Doctor, no others." The implication was clear. Whatever horrors might be buried in the ruins of Blackwood Manor and its underground chambers would remain buried, at least as far as official reports were concerned. In the days that followed, the destruction of Blackwood Manor was attributed to a combination of factors that local authorities could comprehend: faulty gas lighting, improperly stored chemicals from Heinrich Vogel's laboratory, and structural weaknesses in the hastily constructed eastern wing. The deaths of Thaddeus Blackwood and his inner circle were mourned publicly, while privately, many noted that the county's governance seemed to function more transparently in their absence. The disappearances that had plagued the region ceased entirely. Dr. Holcomb provided a carefully edited account of events to Reverend Wilson and a select few others who had been involved in his rescue. The full truth, he reasoned, would serve no purpose except to inspire fear or, worse, curiosity about forces better left undisturbed. He did, however, document everything in a private journal, sealed with instructions that it should be opened only in the event of similar occurrences anywhere in the country. The collapse of the gateway appeared to have been complete, the connection to the Watchers severed by the destruction of the ritual components. But Holcomb could not shake the memory of Blackwood's final warning. That disruption was not the same as prevention. Had the Watchers been completely repelled or merely scattered? Had the collapse of the gateway truly closed the door between realities, or simply damaged the mechanism for controlled passage? Most troubling was the fate of Judge Foster, Reverend Thornton, Mayor Clayton, and the other prominent citizens who had formed Blackwood's inner circle. Their bodies were never recovered from the ruins. Official records listed them as casualties of the disaster, but no funerals were held with open caskets. No remains were ever positively identified. They had simply vanished, along with whatever Watcher entities had been using them as vessels. In the months that followed, Holcomb observed the county carefully for any signs of the Watchers' continued influence. He found none, which should have been reassuring, but instead left him with a persistent unease. If any of the entities had survived in our reality, they would surely have gone to ground, adapting their strategies based on the failure of the Blackwood Covenant. They would be more cautious, more subtle in their manipulations. And they would have learned a crucial lesson, that working through a single family line created a vulnerable point of failure. 5 months after the destruction of Blackwood Manor, Dr. James Holcomb left South Carolina. His stated reason was a teaching position offered at his alma mater in Philadelphia. But his private motivation was the conviction that his continued presence served as a reminder of events best forgotten. And perhaps, though he never admitted this even in his journal, he feared that his exposure to the gateway had left some trace on him, some marker that the Watchers might eventually detect and follow. Before departing, Holcomb visited the ruins of Blackwood Manor one final time. The county had decided to leave the site undeveloped, the crater filled, and the remaining structures demolished. Nature was already reclaiming the grounds, vines and underbrush obscuring the scars in the earth. Standing at the edge of where the eastern wing had once been, Holcomb felt a strange sensation. Not quite a sound or a sight, but a perception that bypassed normal senses. For just a moment, he thought he glimpsed something moving beneath the surface of reality, like a shape seen through frosted glass. Then it was gone, leaving only the mundane ruins and the Carolina wind. What truly happened in Blackwood County in 1807 would never appear in official histories or schoolbooks. The authorities, as Blackwood had predicted at the beginning of our story, ensured that records were altered or destroyed, witnesses silenced or discredited. They said it was for public safety, but perhaps there was another reason. Perhaps some remnant of the Watchers' influence persisted, guiding human institutions to conceal knowledge that might make us vigilant against their return. The Blackwood family name faded from local prominence. Their lands divided and sold to new settlers who knew nothing of the property's history. The silver box that had contained the original artifact was never recovered. The astronomical alignments that had made the 1807 equinox so significant would not recur for centuries. But other alignments, other gateways, other pacts might exist, orchestrated by entities that think in time frames far beyond human generations. You might wonder why this story matters now, over 200 years later. Perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps the Watchers were truly banished by the collapse of Blackwood's gateway, their designs on our reality permanently thwarted. Perhaps the peculiar architectural features occasionally discovered in historic buildings across America are merely coincidental. Perhaps the astronomical societies founded in the early 19th century by men who appeared in multiple cities despite never being documented as traveling between them were entirely innocent in their pursuits. Perhaps the pattern of disappearances that follows certain celestial events even today has conventional explanations. Or perhaps the Watchers are still among us, their methods adapted, their timeline extended, but their ultimate goal unchanged. Perhaps they wait for another perfect alignment, another gateway, another opportunity. The truth, like the entity Holcomb, glimpsed in the ruins of Blackwood Manor, remains just beneath the surface, visible if you know exactly where and how to look, but easily dismissed by minds more comfortable with conventional explanations. What is certain is that the coastal region once known as Blackwood County has been remarkably free of supernatural incidents since 1807. The site where the manor once stood remains undeveloped to this day, protected by historical preservation laws whose origins are obscured in bureaucratic complexity. Local residents avoid the area after dark, not because they know its history, but because of an instinctive unease they can't quite articulate. And, occasionally, during certain astronomical alignments, visitors to the site report seeing lights beneath the surface of the overgrown crater, lights that move with deliberate purpose before fading back into the earth. The Blackwood Covenant may have been broken, but its echoes continue to reverberate through American history, influencing events in ways we have yet to fully comprehend. The secret cult that built a deadly dynasty in the early days of our republic may have fallen, but the entities they served are patient beyond human understanding. They have watched us for centuries. Perhaps they are watching still, waiting for another Jeremiah Blackwood to find their relic, to hear their whispers, to open their gateway. And now you know their story. What you do with this knowledge is your choice. But remember, awareness itself can be a beacon. In learning about the Watchers, you may have inadvertently drawn their attention. If you begin to notice unusual patterns in your daily life, strangers whose features seem somehow fluid, or dreams filled with non-Euclidean geometries and a light that illuminates dimensions you were never meant to perceive, well, perhaps this isn't merely a historical account after all. Perhaps some stories are warnings disguised as entertainment. Perhaps some truths were meant to stay buried in Blackwood County, and in sharing them with you, I've made you part of the pattern too.